These are 4 different ways of doing forms in Django. Before we start, let's get an understanding of why forms are that important, because first they just seem to be one of many parts of a web framework. Considering this user here interacting with our web app, the user has exactly 2 ways on how to do that. One is using links, so following links, GET requests, and the other one is using forms, so submitting data using POST requests. Let's have a look on how to deal with forms in Django. The first way of doing forms in Django is using the good old built-in Django forms. Now on the left-hand side we have my forms.py file. It defines a sign-up form that has 3 fields, email, password, and confirm password. And in the clean method, we just run a little bit of logic to make sure that both passwords are equal. On the right side, you see the corresponding template of the form, and it just defines a post form with the CSRF token, and we're using the Django helper SP to render the form. Now this simple built-in approach has a few advantages and a few disadvantages. First, it comes with Django. There's nothing to install, which is always a win. And it's really quick and easy for simple forms, as the one we've seen before. On the other hand, it's not very flexible once the forms start to get a bit more complex, and it's especially hard to style, meaning it's hard to apply your own CSS. Let's have a look at the second approach using Django forms and handwritten HTML. So we are using the exact same sign-up form from before, so the forms.py looks the same, and this is the corresponding form HTML that this time is handwritten as opposed to using the SP helper. As you see, this is a more verbose way of rendering forms, but it gives you more control. So in order to handle errors, for instance, we would have to go through each field and check whether there are errors and then also print those. Same as with the first approach, there is no dependencies that need to be installed. It's the forms that come built into Django, and it gives us full control over the form layout. The downside is that it's verbose and repetitive, and again, it's quite hard to style because we don't have actual access to the fields. Approach number 3, django-widget-tweaks. So this is the form template, and again, the forms.py is the same. So it's the same sign-up form as before. It has the email field, password field, and the confirm password field. And it looks very similar to the previous approach with the handwritten HTML. The only difference is this render field template tag. And to be honest, this example doesn't really tell you why widget-tweaks is such an amazing library, but what it gives you is essentially this little API on template level that allows you to add classes and attributes in case there is a form error, which is a super handy little shortcut. It allows you to set placeholders and so on. Again, this templating approach is rendering forms on a field level, which means it gives you a lot of flexibility. So let's have a look at the trade-offs. You obviously have more control over form rendering, as mentioned. This approach can be used with other form libraries and ways of rendering forms. And the look and feel of forms live in the HTML, and they don't live inside the forms.py. This is going to become apparent when we have a look at the next approach. The downsides are that you need to install django-widget-tweaks. It's a library that comes with an API that you of course need to learn in order to use this library. And lastly, we have django-crispy-forms. On the left hand side we have the forms.py file that defines the same sign-up form that we used throughout this video. On the right hand side you have the template. As you see, there's a lot of logic, there's a lot of code on the left-hand side in the actual form. And that is because django-crispy-forms uses this form helper that you initialize and set on the form to modify the layout, the look and feel of the form. And that is the reason why on the right-hand side you see the template and it's so minimal. You just load the crispy forms tag and you render the form using crispy forms. Now this approach is on the complete other side of putting all your form rendering into your HTML and doing it even manually. So on one side of the extremes, you have the Django vanilla forms approach, rendering your forms yourself using HTML. And on the other side, you have this approach here, where you're using django-crispy-forms to define the look and feel of your form in the forms.py file, so not in the template file. What are the trade-offs of this approach? So You have a lot of control over the form layout and rendering, again, but you do that in the forms.py, not in the template. There is a lot of CSS framework add-ons. You can have your form rendered nicely using Tailwind and Bootstrap just by installing those packages, and you're reducing the boilerplate in the templates. The obvious downsides are that there is this dependency that you need to install, and if you're using the CSS framework add-ons or packages, those as well, it's relatively complex to set up because you have to instantiate that form helper in your forms.py, and there's this whole DSL that you need to learn. So in django-widget-tweaks, I call it API because it's really just a few template tags that you need to learn on how to chain them. And with django-crispy-forms, you have this form layouting DSL that you need to learn. So what's the conclusion? Which approach is the right one? So as most of the time, it's a trade-off. There's no right or wrong. And I would say there is a tension between control over the form rendering, control over the look and feel of the form, and the verboseness of the form rendering, or how dry is the form rendering. And the Django Forms and handwritten HTML approach gives you the most control over form rendering. You can literally do anything there because you're just handwriting your HTML yourself, but you need to take care of everything yourself as well, like error handling, error states, invalid input, and so on. Then we have django-widget-tweaks, which gives you slightly less control over form rendering. You still render forms in the template and you're rendering form fields and not the form as a whole, which means it gives you a way to do layouts in the template, not in the forms.py. And then we have django-crispy-forms, which sits on the other side of the control dryness graph. It gives you the least amount of control over form rendering, but it gives you instead a DSL that allows you to do form layouts in a way that it's possible within that DSL, within that framework. The cool thing is that django-crispy-forms allows you really to dry up your forms everywhere. And if you are a big company that has put a lot of thought and work and resources into a style guide and how the forms should look like and how they should behave and so on, then it makes sense to build your own DSL, your style guide on top of this django-crispy-forms DSL to make sure that all your forms look the same and behave the same. Personally, I am mostly opting for the django-widget-tweaks approach nowadays because in case I need a little bit more control, I just write more HTML myself. And for forms that I don't care about the look and feel, I can just fall back to either django-crispy-forms or the built-in form rendering methods.